Okay, Peter and the Last Supper. Peter and the Last Supper, John 13, 6 through 10. Somebody read that for me.
He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Jesus replied, you do not realize now what I'm doing, but later you will understand. No, said Peter, you shall never wash my feet. Jesus answered, unless I wash you, you have no part with me. Then Lord Simon Peter replied, not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well. Jesus answered, a person who has had a bath needs only to wash his feet. His whole body is clean, and you are clean, though not every one of you.
Okay. Okay, this is at the Last Supper. If you come to the Monday, Thursday thing, you see it over and over and over again. But this is the Last Supper. And they're meeting on the Thursday night to have the Last Supper. What's wrong with that?
Shouldn't it have been Friday night? Should it have been Friday night?
Should have been Friday night. The Passover feast was typically started at 6 o'clock on Friday night. And that's also the day of worship. Saturday morning, our Saturday morning. See, their day started at 6 o'clock in the evening. It didn't start at midnight. So it was 6 o'clock in the evening, through the night, through noon, to 6 o'clock in the evening again. That was a Jewish day. So they started their day with a meal. And at this particular time, the meal would be the Passover feast. You remember the Passover? The angel came over, they put blood on the lintel of the door, on the side post, and when the angel saw the blood, he passed over them, and they were saved from the avenging angel. The blood was representative of they had used the lamb's blood, and the blood was representative of the blood of Jesus Christ, which would be shed at the final Passover. So they're doing it on a Thursday night. Why? You remember the word that Jesus, when he began the Passover meal, the first words he said to his disciples?
I shall not be with you long. I shall not be with you long.
That was the second thing he said. He said, I have looked forward to sharing this meal with you for a long time. I will not be with you long. Okay. So you were right in the neighborhood, real close. And they had shared at least 3 Passovers up to this time, because he had been ministering with them for 3 years. Why was this one special?
It was the last one.
It was the last one. And it was the last one, it was supposed to be the last one for all of Israel. They were supposed to acknowledge him as the Lamb who came for the salvation of the world, and they were supposed to acknowledge the fulfillment of that whole process. Did they? Nah, they still do it today. Have you ever been to a Passover? I went to one. It was a Messianic Passover. It was at a Jewish home who had accepted Christ, and they were Christians. But they still honored the Passover, and they changed all the words of the whole thing to not to say the Christ will come, but to say the Christ has come. And he has fulfilled Passover. And it was a wonderful, we ought to do it. We really ought to do it sometime. We'll do it for one of our meals sometime. And you have to eat certain foods, specific food. You have to eat a certain kind of fish. And we'll have to go to Bloomington to O'Malley's to get it, because O'Malley's had a huge Jewish section. And they have the Jewish bread made daily and that whole thing. And it's really a wonderful meal. and acknowledges Christ. Okay? But technically, the Passover was over with this last meal because the very next day, Jesus is crying. Jesus' blood is going to be shed, and all the sins of the world are going to be covered. The Passover lamb was to cover my sins for that year. But Jesus' blood covers my sins for my lifetime. It doesn't have to be done over and over. When Jesus died on that cross the next day from this meal, his blood covered every sin that I would ever commit. And he made provision for me. Even, even though we're saved and forgiven, we're still just a bunch of sinners saved by grace.
Amen.
We know, Mother.
I know.
Why did he do it on Thursday?
See it plans on Friday.
His Friday was booked. He was going to be really busy from the minute they walk out of this room. He's going to be really busy with Pilate and Herod and the crown of thorns and the cross. It had to be done early. Also, there was a tradition in Israel after they came back from Babylon. They were captured and taken away to Babylon, and they stayed in Babylon for 70 years. And then they came back home and rebuilt the temple. It wasn't Solomon's temple, but they rebuilt it enough to where they could worship in it. And but while they were gone, the calendar got messed up. I mean, after 70 years, when you're living by somebody else's calendar, maybe you don't know which day is Friday anymore. And there was a big debate as to whether this Thursday was actually Friday or the next day was Friday. So at this point in time, the Jews are actually doing the Passover meal twice because they didn't want to incur the wrath of God because they missed it by a day. Legalism is an ugly, ugly thing. I mean, do you want a God that's got a big long list of things on the wall and he's watching every move you make and he's checking them off as you violate them, and finally he says, "Oh, that's enough, no more grace for you"?
No, but if you were cooking, I'd be okay with two meals 2 days in a row.
They were too. I mean, they had 2 great meals in a row. They weren't complaining about it. But their method and their purpose for doing it was really warped because they were living this legalistic life where every single move had to be perfect or God would strike them dead. I don't know where they got that from. Well, if you're a Philistine, I know where he got it from. Or a prophet of Baal, I know where they got it from. But the Israelites had never incurred that kind of action from God. Now, sometimes he put them into exile to punish them, but it wasn't lightning falling from the sky and wiping out the temple.
The poor guy that tried to catch the ark as it started to fall.
Yeah.
I've always felt bad for that guy.
Yeah, that guy probably had a complaint. Number 3, why did Peter ask the question in verse 6? Lord, are you going to wash my feet?
Because he felt he ought to be washing folks' feet. Because he felt he ought to be washing Jesus' feet.
Say again.
Because he felt he ought to be washing Jesus' feet.
He was real nervous about this thing. And first thing that happened when you walked into the room, you were supposed to have your feet washed. And there was no servant girl there to do that, or a servant person. Secondly, it was the job of the lowest slave, or a slave that was being punished. Okay. If a slave had gotten out of sorts with his master, and the master wanted him to wanted to get his attention and humble him and make him more observant. He would, you know, sometimes you say, no cell phone for a month. Well, back then it was like, you'll be washing feet for the next month and mind your tongue, you know. So it was considered to be the most humbling punishment that a slave could be given. Also in Jewish doctrine, a teacher was allowed to humble his students to teach them humility in order to prepare them to come before an almighty God. So students were expected to do humbling things. Now through this whole day, Peter's being prepared. Jesus said to Peter and James, said, you go and prepare for the feast. He didn't say, go and cater it. He said, you go and prepare for it. So Peter had to go grocery shopping. Now this was Israel. This is not me going to the JC store for my wife. Okay, this is Israel. And men didn't do that kind of thing, even if they weren't being humble. Men didn't go grocery shopping. Men didn't prepare bread. Men didn't do this kind of thing in Israel. Okay. And remember, Peter said to James,
He's going to remember that.
okay, I missed it. What was it?
Chris doesn't want to grocery shop anymore.
Okay.
Hey, the cans say the same thing this week as they did last week.
Okay. Moving along. So Peter's been out running around buying all the things for the Passover feast. And they didn't have a supermarket. I mean, if you needed fish, you went down to the shore and you got the fish. And then if you needed a lamb, you had to go across to the other side of town, find a farmer somewhere, and you had to buy the lamb. Then you had to take it to the priest, and you had to have the priest certify it. And then you had to go over and get the wine at the local vineyard. And you had to run all over Jerusalem to get this thing done. And it was the job of a slave. So Jesus has already had Peter doing this all day long, him and James. Okay? So then they get to the meal and they get into an argument. Do you remember what the argument was? They've had this argument at this point. This is the fourth time they've had this argument in the presence of Jesus. You remember what the argument was?
Who's going to sit on his right side?
Hmm?
Who's going to sit beside him?
Yes. Who will be greatest in the kingdom of heaven, or who will sit on the right side of the throne? Okay. Who will be greatest in the kingdom of heaven? So yeah, you're right. And they had this argument during the meal. I think it's in Luke or Mark where they started this argument on who's greatest in the kingdom of heaven, who's going to be great. Why sit to the right hand of the master? Well, will I sit to the left hand, or will I be over at the end of the table? You know? And they're sitting there arguing about who deserves to do it. Who deserves to do it? Not me. And certainly not these guys. Okay. And so finally Jesus gets up and he walks over and he wraps a towel around his waist. He takes his cloak off. He wraps a towel around his waist. He gets a basin of water and he walks up and he looks Peter right in the eye. Right in the middle of this argument. And Peter looks up and what's his response? Lord, are you going to wash my feet? What does that tell you?
He knew he wasn't worthy.
He knew he wasn't worthy. He knew he was arguing about the wrong thing. And Jesus is standing there with his humbling job. Remember I told you that the master was allowed to humble his students, but he was not allowed to make them take off his sandals. That was the one thing he was not allowed to do. Okay? That was strictly the job of a slave. And humbling them is one thing, but turning them into a slave and humiliating them was totally another. So the Jewish doctrine, now, they didn't get that doctrine from God, okay? God didn't send that down from heaven to Moses. That wasn't in the Old Testament. This was just in Jewish doctrine. They had written after that time. No teacher could require a student to take off his sandals. Okay? And Peter looks up and there's his teacher standing there with this bowl of water in the middle of this argument, and he says, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? That's an admission of guilt. I mean, all of a sudden, it just hits him right between the eyes. And they've been corrected the other 3 times. This is the 4th time. And he told parables. He did teachings on who's greatest in the kingdom of heaven. He had dealt with this and dealt with this and dealt with this. And here it was, the day before he's going to leave them on their own. And they're still arguing about this petty little who's going to sit in what chair. So he walks up to them. Why did Jesus answer as he did? You do not realize what I'm doing, but later you will understand.
I'm not even going to waste my time to explain it to you right now because you won't understand right now.
Yeah, yeah. There's an old saying, if you go down to 5, there's an old saying, it says, life must be lived forward, but it can be only understood backwards. What's that mean? Life must be lived forward, but it can only be understood backwards.
We only understand what happens, not what's going to happen.
Right. Do you know what's going to happen? You know what I'm going to say 5 minutes from now?
Nope.
You know what's going to happen tomorrow, really? I mean, you got things planned. You think you know what's going to happen tomorrow, but does it always follow the plan?
No.
No, it doesn't. So you move forward in faith, not knowing what's going to happen. And have you ever found yourself neck deep in alligators and didn't understand why you were there?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, let's take last week for an instance. Neighbor shot my dog. My wife broke a tooth off, and she has to have an implant, $3,000. Dog bit my granddaughter in the face. I can go on it, but I have no idea where God was last week. But today I look back on it and I saw that he was there all the way. A pit bull grabbed her face. You ever dealt with a pit bull? They are not easy dogs to deal with. And blood everywhere. I mean, blood everywhere. It was so bad that when they got to the emergency room, they took her straight to a treatment room and paged the doctor. They got her cleaned up. She had these 3 little pinpoints. What's the only difference between the dog biting her and 3 little pinpoints?
God.
God
Yeah.
and your prayers. There's no other explanation. I mean, these people in the emergency room are trained. When's the last time you walked into an emergency room and they took you straight to a treatment room? You can figure 2 or 3 hours before you see the doctor. Even on a slow day, they took one look at her and grabbed him and took him straight to an emergency room. And on the way to the emergency room, the nurse said, "Page Dr. So-and-so and get him down here."
What hospital was this?
Peyton Manning Pediatric Center in Indianapolis. Okay. They get her wiped off, and there's a stitch here, and she had a hole here at the corner of her mouth, and they put 2 in it because she talks all the time and she eats all the time, and that hole was going to be worked a lot because her mouth, she's like her Grammy.
You have this recorded, right?
She,
What
I
happened
mean,
to your
she-
dog?
She is a jabberwock. What?
What happened to your dog? I mean,
He-
is he gone?
He runs with the state cop,
Uh-huh.
and the state cop runs 10 miles. Now, my dog used to stay at home. He wouldn't leave the yard, and we'd go out and walk around the creek, and he'd chase the squirrels in the yard and whatever. We started running with the state cop. Well, he would run out the highway and back. Well, then he started running out to the highway and back, and then to the state cop's house and back. Okay? Well, he, on his way back from the state cop's house, the guy a mile down the road had let his chickens out. And he loves to chase things. He's a border collie. He loves to herd things. So he goes over to the yard and starts herding the chickens, and now he's dead. Guy shot. So, bad week. But I look back on it now, and I see God was here, and I see God was here, and yeah, the implant's $3,000, but we had the money. Had a great year, and all of our investments are, stock market's doing great, and I was able to just write a check for it, and no problem. God provided even before it happened. And the whole week was kind of a disaster while I was living it, but I sit here and look back on it now, and I got to see God's provision all the way. I got to feel God's presence all the way. But when the dentist said $29.50, it was like, that wasn't in the budget. But I looked at the checking account balance, and it was like, okay. And we paid for it.
Yeah.
You
You're
see,
not more
we
faithful
live-
than I would have been like, no.
What?
I would have thrown a fit in the dentist's office.
But remember the prescription?
I know. It just takes me longer to remember this.
Yeah.
My head is bigger.
I mean, you're headed toward the drugstore thinking thousands of dollars, and you get there and God's waiting for you. Huh? Isn't it?
And I believe he said $29.50.
Yeah.
The other way. Decimal in the other spot.
Well, I can always wish. Anyway, we live life forward, but we understand it by looking backwards and realizing that God was involved all the way. Every single bit of it was under his control. And we're going to see that later on here. Why did Peter say what he said in verse 8? You shall never wash my feet.
He didn't feel worthy.
Hmm?
He didn't feel worthy.
You didn't feel worthy? Has that ever happened before? Remember John the Baptist? He said, I am not even worthy to loose the thongs of your sandals. You should be baptizing me, not me baptizing you. He got the same response from John the Baptist. But Peter, John said, I should be and you should be. Peter said, no, for the third time. Peter's the only person in the Bible that ever looked at Jesus and said no. Pilate didn't even look at Jesus and say no. Well, this is the third time Peter did it, and he's going to do it 3 more times before it's over. Okay? He needs to be humbled, because a knife is worthless to you unless it's sharp, and a Christian is worthless to God unless he's humble. Why? God just enjoys beating me down? Is that what it's all about? No, it's all about me. It's not about God. Until I've been humbled, it's going to be about me. I preached the sermon. I prepared this. I made this supper. But once I'm humbled, it's God gave me the gift to do that. God gave me the power to do that. God enabled me to do that. And then it's about God, and then I have the power of the throne, rather than operating under my own power. Which you think works out best? Go ahead, you can tell me. God, not me, right? Okay. Why did Jesus want to do it? Because Peter had to be humbled and prepared for what was about to come. And we're going to pick it up at 8 next week, and then shortly thereafter, we're going to eat ribs.
Yeehaw.